Welcome, everybody. You are joining the second meeting of the Westford Budget Task Force, today, June 7th. So we're called to order, and I hope everyone had a chance to look at the minutes. I thought Amy did a great job with the minutes. She's not able to be with us today, though, and so we need a volunteer to take the minutes today. I don't know if anyone would be willing to jump on that.
Sure, I'll take minutes.
Okay, thanks, Erica. Okay, we're going to start off today with going through fiscal 24, the year that we're in, budget, and Dan's going to take us through it. This is sort of an orientation for those who either have not been through this before or want a refresher. So we'll spend about the first 30 minutes of this meeting going through those two. So Dan, take it away.
Great. Tom, do we want to vote to approve the minutes first?
Oh, good call. Okay. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes? Do I have a second?
So moved. Second.
All in favor? We're going to do hands, just even though I know it's crazy.
I don't know if my video is stopped, but I'm waving my hand.
Okay. We've got your audio hand. Okay, so that's unanimous.
And Erica's acting as a voting member today?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Oh,
Thanks, Erica.
Okay, Dan.
Great. I'm gonna pull up the document here. All right, Kristen, you want me to start off or? Yes, okay, I'll dive right into it.
Yes, go
my
ahead.
screen here. So basically what we want to we know not everybody's an expert in municipal finance, so we kind of wanted to go through a couple documents that we have. The first was the budget presentation that Kristen gave at town meeting. This is actually the longer version, but it has a lot of slides on here to kind of give a high level overview on how the budget process went for last year. Then the next one is a revenue presentation I give every year to the Finance Committee and Select Board during the budget hearings. So I'm not going to read through every slide or anything like that, but I'm hoping you have some questions along the way that we can discuss if there's anything that comes up. And then I'm also happy if this is too overwhelming all in one sitting, I'm happy to meet with anybody and kind of go over it one by, individually with people. So any option is okay with me. So can everybody see that? Budget, yeah, looking good, okay. So, we kind of start off with, revenues here, which will get more in depth here. Basically, what we need to determine first is how much in new revenue we're getting each year. We like to kind of use projections, different methods to kind of spell that out. I'm going to go through all these a little bit later, but basically we have this allocation of our new revenue, where we have to look at our general fund revenue, which in FY24 we are projecting about 1.7 million. And then we have to deduct our fixed costs, which are usually our benefits and health insurance for the entire town. Any changes in debt service, you can see a big, it's a positive number here, but it's actually a large decrease to debt service because we paid off a bunch of schools and the highway garage in 2023. And then we have other expenses that are we're just assessed, we don't have a lot of control over, such as the Neshoba Tech assessment. So we factor those in too. So at the end of the day, after we look at basically our new revenue and our fixed costs, we had just under or just over 2.5 million to allocate between the town and the schools next year allocations. So this has been pretty consistent year to year. It goes up and down based on needs, but it was 28% towards the town and 72% towards the schools. So this, we call this the mark cost chart. We came up with this 5-6 years ago. It's been very helpful to explain where the money is going year to year. Skipping around here, we are a AAA community, and we have been for past 9 years. In this document, we put down like a bunch of high-level highlights here on where the money is going to, what our reserves are. Overall, the debt service was the big story this year with the paying off these schools. And then we get into kind of like a little more detail, like public safety needs. What are we doing here? So one of the things that I'm sure will come up in later discussion is that we are using some opera funding to fund our last two firefighter paramedics. We're expected to decrease the percentage used in ARPA each year by 25%. It's about a $35,000 impact to the budget each year.
How many years?
Let's see here. And again, just on the town side, we went through a bunch of changes that we went through. Like we restored some staff management training in the town manager's budget. Our legal services budget was reduced by 20,000 based on past usage. Gasoline's been an issue townwide. We did allocate some ARPA money this year that we used to help supplement budgets, but hopefully we budgeted correctly in 24. See here. Going through some other stuff. Oh, we had one major change, which was called out. Yep, Shana. Nice.
Can I ask you a question on the previous slide that
Sure.
I had? When our Neshoba Valley Tech assessment increases, like additional students switch to Neshoba from Westford, does that money come from out of the, reduces the school budget because there's less head count in the schools or enrollment in the schools, or does that come from a totally different bucket?
So it's a general fund assessment, but it's always on its own. So we budget the exact amount of the assessment. So you're right, it's competing with other funds within the general fund, but it's not taking away from the Westford Public School budget. It's just, we're assessed that off the top. It's taken away from the entire bucket. If that makes sense.
Not that I want to take away from Chris's budget, but I'm just thinking in the sense that we're losing a student in the school system, right? That's departing to Neshoba. So maybe that's something that I was thinking about anyway.
Shana, another way to think of it is if we're losing one student in Westford Public School systems, it doesn't mean that we're decreasing by one teacher or one para or other aspects. So it's really economies of scale. Perhaps if we were losing 12 students, that would have an impact on the school budget, but losing one or two might not.
Definitely makes sense.
Yeah. So we currently have, I think, 76 students at Neshoba Tech. So it's, just under 20 a year that go to school. It's been fairly consistent, increasing a little bit over time. Just other things here, changes that we did for the last budget. The COA van drivers is being a big issue. More and more residents are relying on those services. So we did hire a full-time driver just to make it work so we could provide those services all throughout the day. Our veteran services budget has continued to decrease just based on past usage. There's less people relying on those benefits. Let's see here. Enterprise funds. So these are like businesses that operate within the operating budget. So basically the revenue that they generate go back to pay for the expenses that are incurred to run their operations. Recreation, ambulance, and stormwater are all subsidized. Recreation, they were close to self-funding prior to the COVID pandemic, and then they got hit the hardest at any department, I'd say, stemming from that because all the enrollment went down in their programs, and they're collecting probably, just over 50% of what they were in previous years. So we did work with Michelle Collette, the director, and we reduced expenses there to keep the overall cost down, and so we could, work on making that self-supporting again. It's not quite there yet, but we are subsidizing it, but we are working on enrollment and reducing expenses. Let's see here. So again, this is just more revenue that I'll get to at a later point, kind of a summary of everything that's there. Then we get into the overall expenditures, and you can see that at the end of the day, you want your total revenue to match your total expenditures. That's where we have a balanced budget.
And can I ask another question on that pie chart?
Of course.
So here we have the school budget is 47%. Is that because in the previous slide where you said it's 72%, that's 72% of the available money after our expenses versus here that's 47% of the total budget?
That was exactly right. 72% of the new available general fund money went to the schools and 28% went to the town. Basically.
So I definitely think that's something we want to keep in mind when we're putting together our documentation, is that stress again is 72% of the current budget is going to the schools after the expenditures, right? So that people aren't seeing just the 47% and being like, oh, we're not giving enough to schools. There's only 47%. Just making sure that there's that understanding from the community basis that the difference in the total budget versus the available money when our expenses are taken out.
I think if I can just jump in there too, Dan, I do think, Shana, to that point, that is a question that a lot of people have. And so I think it will be very important as we're looking at all this information to clearly articulate what the different percentages are, because the 72% is the new growth. It's not the pie. And so when we've talked about what is the task of this committee, it's looking at recommendations as to what we're doing with the pie. Does the pie need to enlarge? Does the pie, do the way in which we're slicing up the pie need to change? And so I think I just even know that even within the schools that sometimes people have confusion and question as to what those percentages mean. So I think the more we can show them and then explain each one, because I think it's important to have all of them. And then it's important that people don't confuse them.
Right.
gonna-
So that's what I was thinking is that there's always this confusion about more money for the schools, and our schools, again, we're here to look at it as a town, but I don't want my comments to downplay that we need to give more money to our schools, but there is no money for the schools, right? Increase that total pie. And I feel like we need to keep hammering some of that point too, is that it's the whole pie that needs to increase so that we can funnel more money to the schools, and we can funnel more money also to the other departments that need it, like for police and fire and that kind of stuff. So I think just making that was something I wanted to make sure I understood, because that's what I thought when I read through the slides. But I think when we're putting some of this slide decks together to show the audience, is to really make sure that that part is clear, that this is total pie versus total available.
Thanks, Shanna. Christina?
Yeah, just one other point to kind of tag on to those is that this chart here, all the health insurance is completely taken out. So that 47% of this that the schools are sort of receiving, it doesn't even include the health insurance for the teachers and the employees. So I think that's where people kind of get a little confused too.
Yeah, Dan has a nice table that he made for Valerie, which I'm going to ask him to pull up at the end. And what it does is it basically pulls out things that are shared expenses like debt service and employee benefits, and then looks at just how much, if you take those things that are either shared costs basically shared costs out, it turns out that the schools almost every year get about 70 to 71% of the money. And so we'll get to that and we'll look at that chart together because it's an important chart. But you're right, this basically separates out a whole bunch of shared expenses. If you look at the ratio between the school's budget and the other town departments here, that will give you the right ratio of what the true spending is, because almost all the rest of the pie is really shared expenses.
I don't necessarily know if it gets to 70%, but I think the way that Dan breaks that down, one of the things I think we need to be looking at is, and it's going to be a challenge for us, is how do we compare this to other communities? Because Westford does it a very specific way. And then when we try to compare it to other communities, sometimes their breakdown is different. So we're going to have to really dive into that so that we can, I think, explain that to everybody as we're developing our recommendations.
Yeah, why don't we keep going, and we'll come back to the chart I mentioned with Dan, and I'll take notes as we go about ways that we can make sure we're communicating this well.
Great. All right, something else that is fairly new is the Health Insurance Trust. This just came about on March 31st of 2022. Basically, this is I think it's been great personally. We were able to transfer over $700,000 from our health insurance stabilization. And at this point in time, we have a balance of about $2 million. And that's in spite of having lots and lots of very high claims, about triple the amount that we were budgeted for. So we are keeping a close eye on that. Our stop loss insurance has gone up. I think we're paying about $110,000 per month. That's gone up to $170,000. And we just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago. So we are running at a deficit for the next 2 months of about $80,000. However, when new budget kicks in, the town's going to kick in a higher share. So that should help to even out the tolls for next year. But we're working on the process for coming up with the rate for next year and whatnot. So we'll be doing that over the summer and early fall. But so far, the reason this is good is because, if we have a bad year and we weren't partially self-insured and we were fully insured still, we would get pummeled on the claims with little to no recourse. We could basically have plan adjustments. With us, we're actually getting some of that money back through the stop loss insurance. So it's keeping our balance pretty steady, and we can still have control over not having, say, a 12 or 15% increase next year. So so far it's been working very well.
Dan, can you just comment on if it's the way that we fund that is mandated in some way, or is it up to us as to how much we put in each year?
So it's up to the trust to determine what rate is up there. It's actually Kristen's budget recommendation on how much is actually funded from the town side, which of course we all work together on that. But it's contractual with the unions that for most of our plans, we're doing a 65%, 35% split. So it's employee contributions and the town contribution going in to pay for the monthly insurance.
Thanks.
Was the question, do we have a policy on how much we should be putting into the health insurance trust or
Yeah,
health
that's really what I was
contribution?
Oh, I'm
trying
sorry.
to. Thank you, Kristen. That is.
Sure.
So
Dan, I think there is a policy. Can you explain that?
yeah, we want to be, right now, we want to be covering our monthly costs and then building up the trust to reach a target of 3.7 million is what our advisors have told us should be our minimum target. So right now we're about 2 million. So when we set the rate, we want to take into account that we want to be able to cover our current expenses and then build that trust until we reach that target. So that's really where we want to be. Then once we're at 3.7 million, we want to be between 3.7 and 7.4. We can kind of have some flexibility in how we, treat the increases going forward. But right now we're trying to build. And again, we've only had this for over a year, so we've been doing pretty well. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And then the other thing we have is this OPEB liability, which is it's health and life insurance for our current employees. That it's basically a future obligation. We do have to fund this annually, so we do have a funding plan in place. We just began funding this, I want to say 11 years ago with a $50,000 contribution. That balance is now up to 13.5 million, which is fantastic. So, we do a good job funding this. We can't always fit the full appropriation within the operating budget, which would be ideal. So for this year, we have $1 million coming out in FY24, and we already appropriated 355,000 free cash. So that's another consideration we have going forward because this amount increases each year. And then of course, we have our capital plans. This is basically an overview of the different funding sources for capital. So free cash, we actually had a lot of free cash on hand this year, so we could kind of get more projects done using free cash. We had different types of bonds that were proposed, for both non-excluded, which means that debt is raised within the operating budget and competes with other resources. Then we have excluded debt, which is raised above the tax rate. And this past year, the Blanchard roof was approved. So that was with the excluded debt. So we can raise taxes to pay for those debt payments. We have enterprise bonds, which again, we pay for the debt out of the enterprise accounts. And then we have revenue, which is just kind of like free cash, but it's the revenue from the enterprise. Any other available funds we have, like capital stabilization or something that we can appropriate to put towards capital, we included here. Yeah, so that's basically the end of the expenditure portion here. Any questions on that one from anybody?
It went by pretty fast, Dan. We may, I think later in the work of the community of this committee, we'll have kind of an FAQ style list built up of terms because people have questions like, what is free cash? What can you use it for, et cetera. But let's table that kind of public explainer for now. But if anyone has any specific questions, please.
All right.
Okay,
Bring
why
up
don't we keep going?
All right, I'm gonna bring up the revenue one here. Okay, again, this is a report I give every winter. I'm gonna go somewhat fast through this. First off is the property taxes, which accounts for over 76% of our operating budget. So Prop 2.5 is the main constraint here. Back in 1981, it took effect. where the communities could not increase their tax levy more than 2.5% from the previous year. That's been our main constraint with this. The only way around that is to have an override or to pass excluded debt, then it can go in excess. See, it's summary. So I just want to share the calculation here, zoom in here. So for the FY24 tax levy, what we do is we start with the 23 levy, which was 88.1 million. We can add on the Prop 2.5 increase, so 2.5% of 88.1 million is to 2.2 million. And then we can add on any new growth. If there's new construction or, a lot of, kitchen remodels, anything like that can count as new growth. That's on top of the tax levy. So we add those three together, and then we add on any debt exclusions, which have to match whatever debt payments we're paying for excluded projects, for like the big ticket items like the schools or anything like that. And that gives us our total levy. So in FY24, we'll be seeing a base starting at 21.2 million, and we add on the debt exclusions, and then we go from there. So if we hit our new growth target, that's a great sign. That means we're in okay shape heading into next year. If we don't hit that target, then we're starting off the year with a deficit. So we have to raise that money right away. So
this assumes that we increased taxes going into 2024 by the maximum amount of the 2.5% we're allowed.
That's correct. So I've been working here in finance since 2005, and we've been at that max every year since we've been here. Basically, I think when we opened the new schools that we just paid off in 2002, we had to pass an operating override just to staff the schools and pay for the operating costs. And we were at the limit at that point. So we've always been right up against it each year. And I just defined a bunch of terms here. I won't go through those. Local revenue is basically a much smaller section of the operating budget. It's about $6.87 million per year. Over half of that is from motor vehicle excise. This is just money that comes in for people who have their cars. They pay it, and it's just collected at the tax collector's office. We're about 43,000 of hitting our target for FY24. We're short about 43,000, which we should be able to collect or come near to that in the next couple of weeks before we end the year. I was going to touch base on a couple of these local options. These are hotel and meals tax that we charge in town. Back in 2011, I believe it was, we adopted this local option at town meeting to charge an extra 2% on rooms occupancy and 0.75% on meals tax. So this is the type of revenue that has brought in over the years. During COVID, this was a revenue stream that really got impacted. We lost about half of the revenue that got brought in. So, but we have bounced back since then, especially with meals. We're actually exceeding what we did beforehand because of inflation. And rooms are about 90% of pre-COVID occupancies.
And when you talk about the whole hotel excise there, is that the same thing as a room occupancy tax?
Yep, same thing.
Okay.
And we have all these smaller revenue streams in here. Fees are usually around 300 grand a year. We're a little short this year. Cemetery revenue, licenses and permits, we're actually doing great this year. We're up over 1.1 million so far in June for the year. What happens when we exceed our budget? So our 23 budget was 922,500. That money closes out to free cash at the end of the year through this big calculation. So it's a good thing. And we use that free cash in future years to pay for capital or one-time expenses. But we rely on that free cash to keep our capital plan going. Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you just repeat what you said? Initially, you said something about fees being 300,000.
Yeah.
And then this was 900. What was the difference there?
So with fees there, we have a list here. Let me zoom in here. Like birth certificates, death certificates, like admin.
Oh, okay, so you're talking about different groupings of things. Okay, gotcha.
It's just how they're classified with the DOR. But fees are down a little bit, which is okay because it's more than offset by the licenses and permits.
And Christina, we are finalizing that fee schedule that was asked for. We've had some hiccups, but that will be a vital piece of information, not only for the finance committee, but for this group as well.
And was that also cover licenses and permits? Was it everything
Yes,
or
correct.
just, okay,
Everything.
And then fines are actually way up this year. We budgeted 41,000 for the year. I think we're up over 78,000. Police are really enforcing the speed limits with the new lowered miles per hour in some of the areas. Investment income. So this is where we have a little bit of an opportunity where we're tracking very well. Last year we brought in 47,000 as a whole. We're up to, I think, 320,000 or so through April. So it's a huge increase. We actually we changed our projection back in January. Was it January? Might have been March actually, to increase that projection to 200,000, just based on where rates are going, and we're actually starting to see a lot of that revenue generate. It's been about $50,000 to $60,000 a month, which is historical highs dating back to FY 08-07. Let's see here, miscellaneous recurring. That so I will say this: we do get some revenue in from time to time. That's non-recurring. We can't use this to balance our budget, but it does help our free cash at the end of the day. A lot. It's mostly just random revenue that we don't see year to year. That's like tax title recovery, workers' comp reimbursements, sales of vehicles, stuff like that. All right. So local revenue, again, it's not a huge portion here, but that contains the most different types of revenue here. Again, on state aid, there's all sorts of descriptions here. I'm actually going to flip over to a different spreadsheet here to give you a little update. So the state has not yet set their FY24 budget. However, we track this as we go along. The original governor's budget basically was 20.8 million here, and we have these things called assessments where they charge us for regional expenses, like mosquito control, MBTA, charter school, all this stuff. The good news is, so I have to go back to this page, from where we were with the governor's budget to where we are right now with the Senate Ways and Means budget, our general fund impact is $168,000 to the good. So that's good news. We do have to wait for the conference committee to reconcile that budget and for the governor to sign the official budget, which Governor Baker always did at the end of July, but the process seems to be going a little bit faster this year. So hopefully we hear sooner than later so we can start to talk about that. And then back to revenue, here are state aid projections. So state aid has not kept up over the years. Really, with Chapter 70, we get the minimum year after year because our enrollment has declined, going back to like the, what would you say, Chris? Like the early 2010s or so, it's been declining. So
yeah, it's been over the past 10 to 12 years.
Okay, so we're getting the minimum increase, which the governor's budget included $30 per student, but the Senate budget included $60 per student. So that's great. We're not getting the bare minimum, which is less than a 1% increase. So,
right. So to Dan's point, they hold us harmless at a specific number. But we haven't been able to get our numbers back up where we would see additional state aid.
So we're one out of 100 something communities that received the minimum contribution. I think it's like 139 communities or so. All right, and last up, we have enterprise revenue, which again is just revenue. It goes back to support the operations of those enterprises. And there's history here. I won't go through it all. We also have CPA funds here, again, which are limited in use. They have to be historic, affordable housing, recreation, or open space are the four allowed categories. And then this, sorry, let me go back here. This page here, using free cash to balance the operating budget is never an ideal thing to do. Sometimes we're stuck and have to do it when, if our new growth comes in lower, or state aid comes in lower, or something like that. Definitely during the COVID, we did have to apply little bit of free cash just to get through because the revenue projections dipped way off at the end of the year. So the goal each year and the budget policy for the select board is come back with a balanced budget that does not include using free cash to offset it. So yeah, that's revenue as a whole. And again, I know this is a lot of information I threw out all you, and happy to discuss further at a different point too.
It's a little bit of a fire hose sip there with everybody. Any questions on that? I do want to spend just a second on the chart that I referenced earlier, but we can do questions if anyone has one. Valerie?
Sorry, you may have mentioned this. That new 168, do you know, is it from particular buckets, or is it to count on and it builds into next year as recurring, or is it sort of a fluky thing this year?
No, the governor's budget is usually a little bit lower than what ends up at the final, but basically it's all general fund revenue that tax on, so that, you know, when we come up with the final local revenue, the final new growth, we'll know what we have in addition that could be available for special town meeting for appropriation. So if everything turns out good, we could have some additional capacity there. Okay, we try not to be too conservative with our projections, but we don't want to go over because then we get into trouble. So
Dan, would you mind pulling up the, I'm sorry, go ahead. Other
I'm sorry,
questions?
I just want to make a clarification, actually for Dan. That 168, we have not allocated that in the FY24 budget, right? Okay.
that's correct. Yeah, because we
So
have
that could be like
projection, yeah.
a windfall come special town meeting if it comes through. Okay.
It could be
Thanks.
available. Yep.
So Dan, would you mind pulling up the spreadsheet that you generated for Valerie, just looking at the past 15 years allocation at a high level, sort of town and schools? I think this is a informative sheet. This is in the drive.
Yeah.
And Dan, I added a little thing here at the bottom. So maybe you can just explain what this is, and then I'll explain what I put there at the bottom.
Sure. So this is comparing the allocation of the operating budget, take net of the enterprise, community preservation, and unclassified and debt service, and sort of seeing what the increase year to year is for both the schools and the town departments, just so we have a handle on how the money's been allocated in the past. So down here, you can see the percent of new funds starting in FY11. These were years that we had 0% increases for employees, just based coming off the recession. So that's why you see some pretty limited expense increases here. And then the town does include allocations that occur at special town meetings or annual town meetings when, you know, new information comes out and we have to supplement budget. So that's all included in that. But at the bottom here, you can kind of see the total impact or total allocation. What's this one?
I added, right, you've got the new money
So
allocation.
you add this one, Tom? Okay.
Yeah, that's just the total budget when you take out the shared expenses. So Dr. Chu, Chris, when I was talking about the 70%, if you take out the shared expenses that Dan identified, and then you look at the percent of the budget that is allocated to the schools and to the town, that's what those bottom numbers are. So in fiscal 19, 71.4% was to the schools, 28.6 was to other town functions. And then up to a couple rows up, you've got in a given budget year, the new money allocation between the two. And so you can see it's bounced around a little bit, but in almost every year, around 71% of all of the not shared cost pool money is with the schools. And we've bounced around a little bit on the allocation of new money. It's been trending up lately, but it did bounce around a little bit depending on where the needs were perceived to be at the time.
Okay, thank you for showing that. I actually, when I took the town manager's presentation this year, and then I looked at the way in which I was understanding that Dan was breaking down the amounts that were allocated to the schools, because I wanted to make sure to the point that, you know, yes, some of the healthcare, some of the debt service, all these other aspects, when I had created a chart that I'll share with you, Dan, because if I'm accurate, it would be an interesting thing to just look at here as well too. that looked at it was closer to maybe a 60%. Because I was, like I said, I was trying to clarify these different percentages because people had questions about it, and knowing that people are saying, well, this town allocates this much for the schools, or this town allocates that much for, so I'll share that with you, Dan, and if it makes sense, it might be, it would at least just help me understand what you're talking about in this process, because that's why I'd said, Tom, I don't think that number was that high, because I was considering the way in which, yes, we do have the shared costs. So I get what you're saying.
Yeah, and there are some judgment calls about what you consider shared cost. I mean, the healthcare, I think, is obviously a shared cost and should be allocated, based on headcount. But Dan's excluded some other things too, which I think also makes sense. I mean, you could argue the enterprise funds don't, support the school. So there's some discussion to be had, but whatever yardstick you use, it's actually remarkably consistent over time. And there'll be a little bit of explaining to do, but it does. We're just highlighting a problem that we need a solution for. If you look at just the budget number for schools is 46%. That's way too low. That doesn't represent the true commitment to the schools. So we should just find a way to talk about it so that at least the obvious shared expenses that should be allocated are considered.
Right.
So in any case, part of the journey here will be figuring out how to explain these in a way that people can understand, because I think a lot of people don't understand this. I think a lot of people who are elected officials don't understand this.
Well, and I think another thing that we might need to be able to do is also, as we're looking at all of the, the information that we can gather, for example, when we talk about our comps from the DART districts and things like that, if figuring out what those metrics are, so we can compare, so we can accurately discuss it, because I think that is the point. We know what the metrics are that we're using, and then how does that compare to the way other towns are reporting what's happening, so that we can see, are we in line or are we not in line, which I appreciate.
Okay, just wanted to put a second for this. This is in the budget shared drive. So you can spend more time with it, and I'd love to see, Chris, what you how you allocated the shared costs, because that could be an interesting different choice. Let's go to our 1 o'clock item. We will stop at 1:30 today. So if we don't get through the whole agenda, then we'll just re-agenda for the next time. Dan, could you bring up the draft outline that you and Kristen prepared?
Yeah. Just give me 1 second here.
No problem. Lots of documents. The kind of sprint that we're on here is to get to some working version of this outline so that we can break apart the actual work of the committee into sort of task groups. So we'll probably have a group that's looking at benchmarking and peeling apart what we want to benchmark as we look at the other communities. We'll probably have a group that looks at new revenue sources and helps us outline those and what the potentials are. So you can see here what the starting point is. I don't know if anyone has any immediate reactions to this, or if one of our action items for the next week is for people to make suggestions here. This looks like it was well informed by some of the other budget task force reports that we've seen, with a few things added in. So, I think the beginning, just sort of where we are, makes a lot of sense. I think sharing the history, giving people a context, makes a lot of sense. So there's a whole bunch that's sort of explainer stuff, just helping people understand who are new to the process. This is where we currently have the revenue opportunities. So we would basically walk through all the revenue opportunities that we've seen other towns consider and explain what they are. I think at the expenses, we'll have to have sort of just an explainer about what that is. I think we'll try to help people understand what the allocation levels are, because I think that's very confusing, and a lot of people, I think, are on different pages, different sheets of music on what those actually are. This is also part where we have some of the benchmarking stuff, and a little bit later, we'll pull up the benchmarking reports that Dan has already pulled and take a look at what's there and talk about what's there and what's not there. Challenges for fiscal 25. So I'm going to ask each sort of budget line holder of all these different topics to help come up with a number of what they think the sort of impact is of the change. So to pick solid waste, for example, we're rebidding that contract. We'll have a pretty good sense of what our costs look like relative to history. And so it could come back that the budget line holder for that says, we expect there to be $1 million increase in this line based on the budgets that we have, which far outstrips the normal inflation rate that we would see in these kind of line items. And these will be the building blocks that we use to sort of come up with the gap that we're addressing and trying to find a solution for in this budget. We've already asked so it's pretty clear solid waste, energy, employee non-union salaries. We're going to ask, we'll ask Kristen to sort of build a forecast for that group. Westford has made a commitment over the past, say, a long time, but explicitly for the past 10 years, I think, to competitive pay, where we define competitive pay as looking at a market basket of communities that's appropriate for that function. And then our intent is to get to be average in the category. So another way of saying it is we don't want anyone to be at disadvantage for coming to work at Westford. If people were passionate about municipal service or education, if they come to Westford, they should feel like they're respected and paid in a competitive way relative to other choices they might make. So there's the non-union salaries piece. There's the collective bargain union contracts. So all the upcoming unions that are coming up for negotiation, I will ask each sort of budget line holder for each of those unions to come up with an estimated dollar cost of what it would take to come to market basket average, if we're not there yet. Many of the unions are there because we've been working this way over time. Sometimes you hit sort of a discontinuity where sort of the baseline inflation rate for that salary rate climbs faster. In the school situation, we have a slightly different situation because our benchmark group, which is determined by the state, by the Department of Education, can change based on how our students are performing and how our demographics look. And so it's possible that we, over time get compared to, in Westford's case, higher and higher performing school districts, which tend to be located in higher and higher paying districts. So there's things that move below the surface that can create these jumps in requirement to get to competitive pay, even though we've been trying to do that pretty steadily, each time we negotiate a contract for the past, many years. So anyway, we'll ask each union that's coming up, we'll ask, is there a competitive pay gap? And if so, please give us a dollar number to help this committee do its work to, understand trade-offs and choices. And for all of these, we'll basically ask whoever's responsible for that, controlling that budget line to give us an estimate if there's a sort of a discontinuity with traditional inflation rate. And putting all that together kind of gives us our gap. And so then once we have the gap, once we've got the new revenue sources, once we've contemplated if there are opportunities for greater efficiency or just identified the least painful cuts that we might make if we have to meet a need in the budget that we don't have a way to fund, that'll be sort of the platter of stuff that we give back to the policy committees, to the school committee, to the select board, and to the finance committee to look at. Here are cuts that we could make. Here are things, efficiency gains we should just do anyway because they're just a good idea. Here are the things that represent cuts we could make that are the least painful we could identify. Here are the new revenue sources that we could access, and here's the pathway we would go to access those. And then they'll have all the puzzle pieces to shift everything around and figure out what's best for Westford. We will also probably describe how the excluded debt could change going forward. That'll be more of an explainer than anything that we're deciding or investigating. So basically, are there new building projects that are coming up that we should have on the horizon? We already know the library is coming up, and that's a significant excluded debt expense. So we'll have that out there just to explain to people because it'll have an impact on their tax bill. but that's not something that'll fall under our purview to review. So that's sort of the arc that we have here. I don't know, maybe we can go back to the Brady Bunch view, Dan, and see if anyone has any comments that they just think are important to add, or other things to consider.
I love the Brady Bunch view. That's all right.
I spend too much time on Zoom.
I thought as an overarching, it looked comprehensive. I think obviously as we get into the weeds, we might have some other areas we wanted to add, or things maybe we end up not addressing, but I thought as an overview, it looked like a pretty good start. And I think just to mimic what we talked a little bit with the last meeting was when we looked at the comparison study, I definitely agreed with the sentiment that some of the recommendations are really general and that we might want to get a little bit more specific in ours.
Thanks, Jenna. Erica, did you have a comment?
Yeah, there are things that occurred to me, and I'm just going to read off what I was
Sure.
thinking as I did it. I think we need some definition of our methodology, a little bit stronger discussion of that, and justification of why we approach things certain ways, which would include things like our assumptions, the challenges that we had, for instance, in being able to come up with making sure that we were looking at apples to apples. I think Chris alluded to some of that earlier in the school budget. And when we're looking across towns, if we're comparing ourselves elsewhere, we need to really show that we did our due diligence in coming up with apples to apples when we're doing that sort of thing. I think we're going to need a significant section on those scenarios. I mean, I think it says just tax impact, but we really need to list, I think we have 5 scenarios we're supposed to come up with. We should say what they are, why we came up with them, and an analysis of what their implications are. If we're doing something other than comp towns that were defined by this DOR or by the DESC, then we need to define why we use those market baskets. I know that when I looked at the Hingham document, they referenced a tool that they had created themselves. I don't know if we want to look at their tool, because there was a link to it. I didn't look at it to see if that might, with tweaks, serve us as well, or maybe there's someone there that might help us. But I think if we're going through some of these analysis, we might want to be able to do that. Specifically, I'm thinking of looking at, like, do we want that list of challenges that we have, that that significant list that was just on the outline. Each one of those has a spectrum of possible outcomes. How much are we going to have to spend on each of those things? And there's a range, and we can do either a Monte Carlo analysis, or we could do an algorithm driven analysis to try to come up with the likely range of the gap that we will have next year, that we will have to deal with. And I think that would help. I think Christina asked for it last time, and I think we still need it. A better definition of what the gap is that we're dealing with. And I think having some sort of analysis that does either the Monte Carlo or an algorithm driven analysis would be an important piece of that. And one last thing, two last things. Well, as far as this, okay, sorry, for this particular document, one other thing that I like that the Hingham folks did is that they identified kind of ground rules, and I can show you what they were, or I can just read them to you. But I thought it would be good for us to have an agreement on if we want similar ground rules or to adopt some of theirs. There's 7 of them here, which seemed kind of important.
Why don't we add that to our next agenda? I do think it is a good idea, and let's make an agenda item next time to talk about, just give people a chance to review and think about the ground rules, and then come back and decide what we want ours to be.
So I listed a whole bunch of stuff that I I'm the note taker, right? So probably not everyone wrote it down. So, but you know, I'm happy to, you know, try to take a cut at, you know, how I think some of these might be incorporated into the draft. But since we're going to run out of time, there was one other thing that I really, really felt strongly I needed to say that wasn't necessarily this draft related, but I think we really need to come up with a format, or sorry, a foundation schedule, because October is going to be on us very, very soon, and we're going to want to back up, you know, the date that we have to present back by a few weeks so we can have a draft and comments and revising the draft. We have to be able to split up and do stuff. And I think we can't do it all by committee, big committee. We have to get a plan that makes everyone working at the same time.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So we've been aiming to enough clarity on what the deliverable is to be able to split up. And I think maybe we can do that now. I feel like we can make further changes, but maybe we're close. So I think there'll be a benchmark team, maybe two, maybe one for schools and maybe one for other municipal functions, and a new revenue group. So next time, let's do exactly that. Let's talk about kind of what the arc of the schedule looks like and see if we're ready to break into work teams to do some of that digging. Valerie?
Yeah, I just wanted to check, Garrick, do you mean when you say ground rules, do you mean like the part where they say, you know, we're going to work in a collegial constructive manner, or do you mean like we're going to use a 5-year forecast and examine non-text? Is it like the 7 tasks that they have, or
They say
like
ensure
how to work
continuous,
together?
the things that they want to make sure that they do, or they're going to ensure continuous delivery of town services, ensure that the people with varied
okay.
economic means remain part of our community, provide the acquisition and maintenance of infrastructure, provide guidance for the use of town resources for emergencies, i.e., you know, free cash, et cetera. Ensure the town's commitment to climate action, maintain stable tax rates, and preserve the town's credit rating. Those are the ones that I was talking about.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, useful guide rails when we look at you know, what potential cuts we might need to make if we had to reach a balanced budget and accept some of these costs. So that's a good add. Just in case we run out of time, we should decide on chair and vice chair and clerk. I think all 3 of those probably need to be permanent members of the committee as opposed to alternates. So why don't we proceed with that? I don't know if anyone has any nominations for chair.
I'd nominate you, Tom. I think you're actually doing an excellent job. I would nominate you if you'd be willing.
All right.
Second.
I'll second this.
Okay. All in favor? Okay, thank you. We now open nominations for vice chair. I think Valerie would make an excellent vice chair if she's willing to serve.
I would second that.
We could just let it sit for like 60 more seconds, make sure there's no other interest. But yes, of course, willing to if needed.
Any other nominees?
And or interest. I think that is an excellent.
Yeah.
If there's a specific interest, I think that we should definitely consider.
Okay. So that's my nomination. I think I need a second.
Oh, I'll second that. I think I seconded it too early.
Oh, you did. Thanks, Chris. You did.
Oh.
Yep, Shanna.
I thought, do we need to all?
Oh, okay, we're voting. Okay. Yep, all in favor?
No.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Valerie. And clerk, who would be willing to consider acting as clerk? Which is primarily taking minutes at this meeting.
And Dan and I have bounced off of each other, perhaps bringing in a staff person to take minutes, just so all members can participate closely. So the clerk may not always have to take the minutes if we can find a staff person to help assist us.
Anybody willing to take that on?
I mean, I'll do it if there's some help. I just wasn't readily volunteering because I wanted to really be focused on what we're talking about versus having to focus on writing things down. But if we're able to maybe supplement it with someone else, that would be great. But if no one else wants to do it, I'll volunteer.
Okay, yeah, I'll make the nomination. And we need a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Thanks, Sheena.
Yeah, I think that, thank you for doing that, and I like the idea a lot, Kristen, of asking someone else on staff to take the notes. I think what Amy did last time was perfect. It does not need to be at a high level of detail. These meetings are recorded and will be accessible to the public, so just the key points is fine.
Who seconded? Sorry.
I did.
Valerie.
Yeah. And who seconded for chair?
I did.
Thanks. Oh, no, you nominated.
Oh, that's right.
I did. That's right.
Sorry.
Use the I.
I
Valerie
think
did
Valerie.
Thanks.
before Tom could change his mind.
Let's in the last minute that we have, if it's okay with, well, we also have to set the next meeting. Let's set the next meeting first. I will be in transit at this time next week. We can do a doodle poll, but just on the off chance, same time, but on Thursday. Can that work?
Just to confirm, you're talking about Thursday, June 15th,
Yes.
12:30.
I'd be available.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm available.
Yeah, that works for me.
I'm not available.
I'm available.
I'm sorry, who said they were not available?
I am
Shane has,
not. I have
Okay.
to go on site to actually go to my place of employment, which I do not like to do, but I do have to go on site next week.
Is it every day next week, Sheena, or?
I could do the same time on Tuesday if that worked.
I'm going to be in Europe on a business trip, and
Oh,
so I'm not sure it'll be easy for me to join.
Or Friday at the same time.
I could do Friday.
With Friday at the same
How
time.
does Friday same time look?
The 16th,
The 16th.
12:30.
I could make that work.
yeah, it works for me.
Yeah, I could do that.
You can make it work, Erica? Okay, thank you. Okay, when do we plan on Friday then next week? And good idea, Erica. I think we'll focus on it next time. We'll come back and look at the comparable communities again. We will try to put some shape to the overall arc. We'll decide if we're at a kind of a decent working model for the outline and try to break into work groups.
Tom, I'd volunteer to try to incorporate some of the things I suggested into the outline as a possible. Would you
Yeah,
like me?
please. And so I don't know if it's in a editable Word form, Dan, but maybe you could put that in the shared drive so Erica can edit that.
So we weren't
Okay.
going to necessarily edit documents on the shared drive just for open meetings. So if anybody has anything, just send it to Dan and I, and we're happy to update it and then get it back to the group.
Or if it's easier for you, Erica, they could send you a Word copy. You could edit it and then email the Word copy back.
If you would,
Yeah.
please.
If we have one other second, let me just ask, is the Budget Task Force website live? I should know this, but I don't. It
Yes,
is-
so
it
the
is live?
website is live.
Okay.
Dan, have you gotten a response from WestfordCAT about the videos?
Yeah, they said they could store them and post them to YouTube and everything. So yeah, it seems like it's gonna work. Basically, I just have to send a file to Mike Wells and we'll get those uploaded. We'll put a link to those videos on the webpage.
One standing agenda item for us will be to decide what information that we've been using we want to make public. So at the end of each meeting, I think we'll want to say, okay, these are working documents. This is information we found that's useful. How do we feel about moving it over? So I guess for this meeting, even though it's elsewhere on the town website, I would put up the links to the two presentations that Dan gave, just for folks that want to be oriented. I'm not sure we have anything else we're ready to post to the public yet, but why don't we make sure, Dan, if we could make sure there are links to those two for the eager public members.
Sure.
In the final second, so Dan, you outputted the two benchmark groups. One is the one the schools are using. The other is the DOR recommendation for comparable communities, municipal communities. If people haven't had a chance to look at those, please take a look before next time. What I did to confuse and pollute Dan's excellent spreadsheet was I just made a column below that was just percentages. So you get to see, it basically lists all the comparable communities based on those two sources, and then it goes through the key budget line items. And what I did is I converted that to percentage of the total budget, so I could see where Westford stood in the different two groups in terms of spending. So just if you look at the top, you see the numbers. If you look at the bottom, you see the percentages, which makes it easy to kind of see, are we an outlier relative to other communities in terms of that percentage measurement?
And just to clarify, I believe I misspoke at the last meeting. So the town's comparable communities are not the DORs. It's actually communities that we've been using for the past 20 years with both our non-union and union employees. So we're happy to dig into that more as well if necessary.
If we could also put the DOR community recommendation, that would be useful.
I don't know if we'll dig into it, but I don't know if they're available. We'll double check.
Okay, got it.
I
Got it.
looked,
I
I
mean,
couldn't find any.
And perhaps what, if I could just quickly add that, just for everybody to be aware, and we can talk more about it next meeting, but since we'll be posting that, the school list is the DART communities plus the geographic towns that touch us. That's what that has become, what we found has become the industry standard, that schools use both of those things. They use some geographic aspect along with the DART communities. And so maybe, Dan, I'll work with you to make sure that we can tell people which one. I mean, people would know which ones are touching us, but like Acton Boxborough is on both lists, right? But then the other communities are the DART, just so that people reading it would know what it is.
Yeah, thanks. And certainly in the document, we'll explain that and explain how we came to the conclusion that that's the right set to use.
Right.
Tom, which document are you talking about that you did add percentages?
If you go to the top level, let's see, budget task force folder, they're the market communities. Let's see.
I think it was a spreadsheet.
Yeah, it's a spreadsheet, and one is the school market. Let me make sure
It's town market community comparison report and school market community comparison.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just opening up. Yeah, so that is the one that has just as I described. And again, there's a lot of reasons that these numbers might be high or low or different that make perfect sense. But just for me to scan it, it helped me to just look at the percentages and see where are we low, where are we high, just as a very, very early first cut. So if you could take a look at those over the next week and a couple of days, that would be great, because we are going to try to ratchet down on what we think our comparables are next time, because that's an important ingredient, obviously, for the benchmark team. Any other comments or questions for today? We went a little bit over, so I apologize for that. There will be meetings when we just let it go as long as it wants to go, but we would announce that in advance. If we're trying to wrestle some important thing to the ground, we might say, you know, this might be a 90-minute meeting or this might be longer. So, but not today.
Motion to adjourn.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Nice.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
good one.